Welcome back to the Python programming series. And this is episode 4, and in the last video we took a closer look at control flow and logical operators in Python. And in this video we're going to take a closer look at functions and loops in Python, both of which are very important in almost any program. So let's dive right into it by defining a function and asking ourselves what it's used for. Well, functions are just callable blocks of code in a program, and they're usually defined for reusing that block of code, or just to make the program a little more organized. And loops categorize into two different types, at least in Python, and those two are for loops and while loops. For loops are specifically purposed for iterating through sequential data sets like lists, tuples, and even strings, since those are still sequences of characters. And while loops are purposed for looping through code while a certain condition or multiple conditions are true. So let's take a look at defining and actually using a function. So we're going to use the def keyword to actually define the function. We're going to name the function. For now, I'm just going to call mine literally function. We follow that with a pair of parentheses, and I will elaborate on why in just a little bit. And we actually implement the body of the function. Okay. And we actually need to call the function to actually execute. And we follow that with a pair of parentheses again, and we see once we run it, we get hello world in the console, or whatever you implemented in the body of the function, that's what runs. And so that's pretty simple enough. Now let's actually deal with why we put those parentheses and what's the use of them. Well, the use of these parentheses are to put in parameters and arguments. Now, parameters specifically are the generic criteria and input you want to be put in whenever that function is called or used. So let's say each time we call this specific function, we want a name to be passed in. Okay, and let's actually just quickly implement that name here so it's actually useful in our function. And whenever we call the function now, we actually need to pass in a name. And so let's just say Joe. That's just an example name. And so let's run that. And you see we got hello Joe because we passed in the argument Joe for the parameter name, and the program used that in the print statement. Now, a quick side note on this terminology. A lot of people use parameters and arguments, those two terms, interchangeably. Yes, they are very similar and essentially the same thing, but obviously not the exact same thing since they're two different words. So let's clear up the difference here. Parameters are specifically the generic criteria and names given to the needed input in the function definition here. So a parameter would be name. But arguments are the specific instances of those parameters when you call the function. And so in this case, Joe is an argument, not a parameter. So yes, that's what I wanted to clear up about the terminology. Now let's take a specific look at a pretty useful part of parameters, which are just default parameters. And so default values of parameters just make certain parameters optional. So when you actually put in the parameters in the function definition, you can also just make it equal to a certain value. And so if we don't pass in a value for that specific parameter, when we actually call the function, it'll just use the default value that's already been defined up here. So let's just say u, and let's say if we don't pass in a specific name for that parameter, then it'll just use u as the name parameter. Great. Now let's take a look at the return keyword. Return keyword is also pretty useful and important in functions since it can only be used in functions. Now, obviously, not every function needs a return keyword, but it is useful. So return keyword is self-explanatory, like a lot of things in Python, but not to say that Python is simple, but you get the gist. So the return keyword returns a specific value or specific values from within a function. So let's just say return. And a quick side note on return is actually that return is if it's not in an if statement within the function or anything like that, and if it's in the main line of the function, then no code can really come after it since that code won't be executed. The return basically like implicitly indicates the end of a function, essentially. So we can just say return, and let's say we just want to return the name value. Now, whenever you return a value from a function, it doesn't have to be a parameter, but in our case, it is right here. Okay, so let's say return name, and when we actually, we can now print the function called function. And whenever we print it, we're actually just referring to whatever value or values are returned from the function. So when we're printing, we're literally just printing the name, the returned value. And since function is actually being called here, the function is going to run, and then we are going to print out the name, the returned value, which is name. So let's quickly run this, and you see we got hello you, which is the actual function running. And then since the name was returned, we actually printed out the name, which is that default parameter we assigned in the function definition. Great. That's pretty much all there is to the basics of functions. So let's just quickly comment out this function statement. And let's take a look at while and for loops in Python. So let's begin with a for loop. Again, for loops are just for iterating through sequential data sets. So going through each element of a sequence of data. So you actually say for, and in Python and a lot of programming languages, it's conventional to use I just to stand for iterator as just a name for each element in the sequence of data. So whenever you go through that sequence of data, each element will be called I in each instance of the loop. So for I in, so that's basically saying for each element in sequence of data, let's just say my data. Print I. Okay. My data, and we actually need to define my data list. Let's just make it a list. Simple list 1, 2, and 3. Oh god, I cannot type today. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's pretty much what a for loop can do with that. You can do many things with for loop. You can actually mutate that sequence of data if you want. But my purpose right now is not to exactly show mutation with it, but just to show that you can iterate through sequences of data with it and do many other things. Yeah. So what this is going to do is just go through each element of the my data list, and it's just going to print it out to the console. So let's see that, and you see we got 1, 2, and 3. Great, that's what we expected. And mutation can be slightly tricky in a very simple sense with a for loop or while loop of a sequence of data. And that's because you have to explicitly insert each value into each index. If you don't understand what I'm saying right now, don't worry about it. That's not our focus right now. Our focus is just how to use for loops in general. Okay, so that's essentially what a for loop is for. Let's just comment that out. Again, these triple quotation marks, they're just used for multi-line strings and pretty much multi-line comments that's ignored by Python. So now let's deal with the while loop. So we just say while, and now we have a condition here, or multiple conditions. We're just going to deal with one condition, but you can still use the and or logical operators to have multiple conditions. But we're just going to use one right now. Let's just say while. Oh wait. Well, before we actually define that, let's just say my int, just a random variable, is equal to 0. We can say while my int is greater than less than 10. So we can expect whatever we assuming that we increment my int by 1 each time. This, by the way, plus equals is just another way of saying equals my int plus 1. That's essentially another way of saying it. Okay, so we can assume that since we're incrementing the my int by 1 each time, we can assume that this while loop will iterate 10 times. So it'll execute the code under it 10 times. Okay, so let's just say print my int. Okay. Now we see we started from 0 all the way until 9. If we increment this before the print statement, we can just get 1 to 10. And you see we got 1 to 10 in the console. Okay, so that's essentially what the while loop is. And again, you can use logical operators and what have you in the actual condition as the actual conditions to conjunct conditions. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to while loops. I'm just kind of doing that on the fly, but yeah, you get the gist of that. It just holds true and keeps executing code as long as its conditions are true, according to the logical operators, if there are any. Great. Let's comment that out. Just our program a little organized. I can't really type today. Okay. Yes, that is essentially what we need to know about functions and loops in Python right now. Now, again, there are different types of loops in other programming languages, like do while and Java and C++. You don't need to worry about that kind of stuff. But yes, these are the essential pieces of knowledge you need about loops and functions in Python. So that is all I had to go over in this video, and I will see you in the next video.